before we start in on Equiano, right? Everybody knows the exam is Thursday, right? And the first paper is due on Tuesday. So this is your last chance in class to ask any questions you have about the exam or the paper. So does anybody have anything they want to say about it or they want to ask about it before we proceed? Yeah, Jonathan.
Is it just, is Equiano going to be in that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Equiano will also be on the exam.
Okay.
Yeah, everything we've done up to today will be on the exam. Yeah, James.
Will the class period be the same time as normal, or will it...
Yep, same as normal. Yeah, you'll have 75 minutes for the exam, and I'll keep a sort of running countdown, right? So I'll give you a warning when half an hour has elapsed, when an hour has elapsed, so on and so forth. Any other questions? Any questions with the paper? Yeah, Jonathan.
Can you give me feedback on mine?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. It's okay. It's sitting in the Dropbox file. Okay, that's okay.
All right.
That's why I missed it. All right. So yeah, I will get back to you about that probably later today. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Okay. Nothing else?
Is it turnitin.com?
Yeah, the Dropbox automatically runs it through Turnitin.com. Anything else?
Do you need a hard copy too?
No, I don't need a hard copy. We can save a few trees. Anything else? Okay, then just a couple of things I've got on the website here for you to help you out with Equiano. The first is a website. It's been put together by a British Equiano scholar. His name's Bricken Carey, and it includes links to a number of resources, a map, for example, of all of the places that Equiano traveled to in the course of his narrative, as well as much other interesting and useful information. We have also a link to, I wish this computer was faster, the Equiano Project, it's an interactive resource hosted by the Equiano Society and the art museums of the city of Birmingham in England. And there are interactive little tours you can take of their Equiano exhibit. Which I don't believe, it traveled around England a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's still in motion. Now, if we had an up-to-date browser, this would actually be a really cool thing to show you. But yeah, this is an interactive resource that maps out the transatlantic slave trade. So there are really good interactive graphics when you click on the various links, which again, if we were a little bit more tech savvy here, would work. But they don't here. They probably will if you try this at home. And finally, there is also a link to one of those BBC in Our Time podcasts about the links between the slave trade and the growth of the British Empire, the fact that slavery was very much a part of the British imperial projects. So, that's that. Now, I just want to focus for a minute on this image, right? This is the frontispiece for one of the early editions of Equiano's narrative. Now, what do you notice? Do you notice anything in particular about his self-presentation here? Like, just look at the portrait. Anything about the way he's dressed, about what he's holding?
Just like a free person.
Yeah, definitely dressed like a free person. What do we know? He's got buttons on his coats. He's got a ruffled collar, lace cuffs. What would this indicate about relative level of prosperity?
You got money.
Yeah, someone who's reasonably wealthy, right? Wealthy enough to be late 18th century fashionable. And indeed, the publication of this narrative, combined with Equiano's natural business acumen, did make him actually quite rich. He was certainly the richest person of African descent in Europe at the time that he died. Anything else you notice about his self-presentation here?
Educated.
Okay, what makes you say educated?
He's holding like a pamphlet or maybe a small book.
Yeah, he's holding a book. Which is, an indication of, education, particularly of literacy. And can anybody see what this says here? What's the book that he's holding? It's a little bit small.
Is it a Bible?
It's a Bible, yes. He's got the Acts of the Apostles open, and there are some Equiano scholars who argue that the passage he's got his thumb on is the verse, the chapter in which the Ethiopian eunuch is baptized and converted. So he's not just holding a book, he's holding a Bible. And he's holding it possibly at a very, very meaningful passage. Now, the style of dress here as well would make him recognizable to a late 18th century audience as a Methodist lay preacher. Bless you. And again, he's not a clergyman. But this style of coat, this style of collar would have been worn by a lay preacher. The Methodist movement started out in the Church of England as an attempt to reform the Church of England and to kind of strip it of what were believed to be overly popish, that is, overly Catholic ornamentations. So he's affiliating himself directly in terms of his appearance with the Methodist movement. Right, he's holding the Bible. Anything else that you notice about this image?
He has his hair combed,
Yep.
like everybody else.
Yep, hair combed back in that typical kind of round-headed 18th century style, right?
It's like George Washington.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this is the same sort of portrait position we see lots of important late 18th century personages taking, right? So he's presenting himself, he refers to himself in the title as Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa the African. Is he presenting himself as an African?
No.
He's presenting himself as a European. Right. He's got a King James Bible, European clothes, European hairstyle. Now, the music that I was playing as you were coming in today, trust me, this is relevant. It's a violin concerto composed by a guy by the name of Chevalier de Saint-Georges. And de Saint-Georges was born in the French colony that was then called Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. He was the son of a plantation owner and a slave who worked on the plantation. So he was a person of mixed race. And in addition to composing violin concertos, He was also an expert fencer. In fact, a champion fencer. And he taught Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who would be most famous for losing her head to the Revolution, how to play the violin. He was called by the French Le Mozart Noir, or the Black Mozart. So he's an exact contemporary of Equiano, right? They're born in the same year, 1745. They both die in the 1790s. And they both belong to the world of what's sometimes called the Atlantic Creole. Anybody familiar with this word Creole? Do you know what Creole means?
So like a French.
It's a French-derived term, right? What is, like, the language that is most commonly spoken in Haiti today, for example, is often called Creole. What are the features of that language? Is it French?
No, it's a bunch of languages mixed together.
Exactly, yeah. It's a combination of French and a bunch of different West African languages, right? Plus even a little bit of English thrown in. So a Creole is a kind of hybridization of language, right? If we're talking about it in linguistic terms. If we're talking about it in cultural terms, we are still talking about a kind of hybrid cultural identity. Right? An Atlantic Creole is someone who is not solely African, solely European, or solely American, but someone who, in their racial or ethnic makeup or in their cultural background, is somehow a blend of all three. So to give you a definition of an Atlantic Creole, right? This is from the historian Ira Berlin. Right? Along the periphery of the Atlantic, first in Africa, then in Europe, and finally in the Americas, Anglophone African society was a product of the momentous meeting of Africans and Europeans and of their equally fateful encounter with the peoples of the Americas. Although the countenances of these new people of the Atlantic Creoles, might bear the features of Africa, Europe, or the Americas in whole or in part, their beginnings, strictly speaking, were in none of those places. Instead, by their experiences and sometimes by their persons, they were part of the three worlds that came together along the Atlantic littoral. Familiar with the commerce of the Atlantic, fluent in its new languages, and intimate with its trade and cultures, they were cosmopolitan in the fullest sense. So a Creole, an Atlantic Creole by Berlin's definition, is essentially someone without a single nation. Someone who belongs really to the trade routes around the Atlantic rather than to any specific place. Now, does Equiano seem to be making reference in what you read for today to this sort of person in any way? Does Equiano at any point in his narrative seem to refer to this process of becoming a Creole, or people who have these sorts of mixed identities?
I think it's the same thing, yeah.
Okay.
He's traveling the Atlantic a lot, and he's involved with the European, just all the nations, really.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of what made Equiano's life so interesting was that he was one of the most widely traveled human beings of his age. The person who purchased him was a ship's captain. And so he spent most of his adult life at sea. Now, this also allowed him certain privileges that were typically not permitted to slaves on land. Shipboard societies tended to be much more democratic than land-based societies. You were less defined by your actual social standing if you were served on a ship than by what you were capable of doing. So Equiano managed to distinguish himself as a sailor numerous times, but then, whenever he gets back on land, is reminded of what his status really is. So it's again this tension between, right, the condition and the state of slavery, right? The condition meaning what? Remind me what this means? What's the distinction?
The physical conditions.
Yep, your physical material conditions, yes. Good. Basically, how well or how poorly you're treated. And the state of slavery then refers to what?
Mental, emotional.
Yep, your mental, your sense of identity, right, as a slave. So even when he is given a good deal of freedom and relatively well treated, right, it doesn't change his actual status, it doesn't change his identity. And we have here as well reminders that his identity is in some way determined by other people who use him as a token of exchange, right? If we look, for example, towards the end of this, on page 97, in this place, I was called Jacob, but on board the African Snow, I was called Michael. I had been some time in this miserable, forlorn, and much dejected state, without having anyone to talk to, which made my life a burden, when the kind and unknown hand of the Creator, who in very deed leads the blind in a way they know not, now began to appear to my comfort. For one day the captain of a merchant ship, called the Industrious Bee, came on some business to my master's house. This gentleman, whose name was Michael Henry Pascal, was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, but now commanded this trading ship, which was somewhere in the confines of the country many miles off. While he was at my master's house, it happened that he saw me, and liked me so well that he made a purchase of me. I think I have often heard him say he gave 30 or 40 pounds sterling for me, but I do not now remember which. However, he meant me for a present to some of his friends in England. And as I was sent accordingly from the house of my then master, one Mr. Campbell, to the place where the ship lay, I was conducted on horseback by an elderly black man, a mode of traveling which appeared very odd to me. When I arrived, I was carried on board a fine large ship, loaded with tobacco, etc., and just ready to sail for England. I now thought my condition much mended. I had sails to lie on, and plenty of good victuals to eat, and everybody on board used me very kindly, quite contrary to what I had seen of any white people before. I therefore began to think that they were all not of the same disposition. So he sees here an improvement in his material conditions, right? He's no longer in a house where people are walking around wearing iron muzzles, right? He has a more comfortable place to sleep, more to eat, and people are being nicer to him, right? Improvement in condition. But we continue. A few days after I was on board, we sailed for England. I was still at a loss to conjecture my destiny. By this time, however, I could smatter a little imperfect English, and I wanted to know as well as I could where we were going. Some of the people of the ship used to tell me that they were going to carry me back to my own country, and this made me very happy. I was quite rejoiced at the sound of going back, and thought if I should get home, what wonders I should have to tell. But I was reserved for another fate, and was soon undeceived when we came within sight of the English coast. While I was on board this ship, my captain and master named me Gustavus Vasa. I at that time began to understand him a little, and refused to be called so, and told him as well as I could that I would be called Jacob. But he said I should not, and still called me Gustavus. And when I refused to answer to my new name, which at first I did, it gained me many a cuff. So at length I submitted, and was obliged to bear the present name, by which I have been known ever since. So he thinks things are looking up for him, right? Because his material conditions are improved. But then how is he reminded of his state?
Because they were refusing
Yeah, or at least the name he chooses to be called, right? He says, no, my name is not Gustavus Vasa, right? Call me Jacob. It's like, no, you're Gustavus Vasa, right? Pardon?
No, I thought it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's just,
Yeah, he was like, yeah, I think I can speak out now. So yeah, my name's actually Jacob. No, it's not. Gustavo.
yeah, it's like, how many of you have ever seen, there was a, Roots, exactly, yeah, okay, yeah. My name is Kunta Kinte, yeah. Where essentially they tie the guy who played Geordi on Star Trek to a post, and they flog him to try to beat his name out of him, right? We see a very similar thing happening here. Every time he refuses to respond to the name he's been given by the captain, he gets hit. Until finally he submits and agrees to be called by the new name. So even when in general his material conditions are better, there's still something there to remind him that he is not free, that he has relatively few choices. His options are limited. Was there anything that really struck you about Equiano's narrative? Was there anything that you were confused about or that you were really interested in?
Just him moving from like Africa to like Europe, and then he's seen the pictures, and
Uh-huh.
it was like, how they kept the dead bodies or something like that, and like even like
Mhm.
them just reading, he was like the books are talking to them or something like that. It's just crazy.
Yeah, he's confused the first time he sees a book, right? Let's look on page 98 here. Actually, if you can you read that paragraph, Jonathan? Last one on 98.
I had often seen my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had beginning. For that purpose, I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put my ears to it. When alone, in hopes it would answer me, I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent.
Now, some of this is for comic effect, right? We know that this guy can, in fact, read and write, right? He wrote a friggin' book. He also embarked on what was really like the first modern book tour, right? You know how it's sort of obligatory today? An author publishes a book, and so the publisher sends that author out to Barnes and Nobles across the country to give a short reading and sign copies of the book and what have you. He's really the first writer to do that, to drum up publicity for his book. When I worked in publishing before I went to grad school, that was actually, my job was booking those kinds of desultory experiences. And it was usually depressing for everyone involved, myself included, because I had to talk to people on the phone, and I don't like that. But yeah, so this whole talking book incident, right? Clearly, he knows how a book actually works, right? Does this seem to be part of a larger discourse in his narrative? How does he usually respond when faced with unfamiliar Western cultural artifacts?
He thinks it's magical.
Yeah, that it has some sort of magic. Right? They show him that navigation device, and he's like, whoa, sorcery. The clouds look like land, amazing. Right? He believes when he has to fan his master in Virginia that the portrait and the clock on the wall are watching him, right, spying on him. Right? Because these are things that he does that he is unfamiliar with. So they're frightening, they're magical. Now the book thing as well, what does this suggest about how information would have been transmitted in the culture he grew up in? Why does he expect the book to talk?
He grew up in an oral tradition
Mhm.
society.
Yeah, he's comparing the kind of live oral tradition that he grew up with with a kind of static Western literary tradition, right? Every time you talk to that book, it's going to say the same thing, right? You can't really have a conversation with it. I mean, to an extent you can, right? Like I scribble things in the margins, to make notes for myself, things that I'm thinking about, or, things that, like, aha, I must note this passage, right? But the book isn't going to talk back to me, right? It's never going to change what it says. It's never going to change its response. The only thing that changes is me. And this whole narrative, this whole autobiography is essentially a long narrative of change. He's writing in a tradition. It's in some ways similar to what Rousseau was doing, called the picaresque. And why am I unable to spell things when I write them on the board? Picaresque. Candide is a picaresque narrative as well. Does anybody know what this word means? Bless you.
A bunch of short stories in a narrative.
Yeah, it's episodic, right? It's a bunch of short little episodes that happen to the same character. The hero of a picaresque narrative is called a picaro. Right. These are Spanish terms. This kind of novel originated in Spain in the 16th century. Think something like Don Quixote. But yeah, the picaro is a hero who basically muddles through using his wits. Right, he gets himself out of all kinds of hardships using his native cleverness. And the one thing that does remain consistent throughout the picaresque narrative is there is a sort of development or process of education that often happens, right? Equiano is not going to remain the naive little boy who thinks that navigation instruments are magical, who thinks that portraits are staring at him, who thinks that books are going to talk back to him. Right? There is going to be a process of education here, and indeed, a process, we don't see it, we only get portions of the early part of the narrative, of spiritual conversion as well. But yeah, all of these episodes in which he sort of muddles through lead up to a kind of spiritual revelation. There's a point sort of near the middle of the autobiography in which he's in a ship near the Arctic Circle, and he thinks he's about to die, and worries about the state of what would the state of my soul be if I died right now, and so this leads to a spiritual conversion. Anything else you guys notice about this? That you want to comment on or ask about? What else interested you about this?
Like black people were selling other black people.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that happened. Yeah. But in the beginning, it was talking about like people still on this soil land, land, and I was like, what's going on? Like, what's happening?
Yeah. Well, and we can actually, we can trace that through other narratives as well, right? If we think back, for example, to Orinoco, how do the European traders get their slaves in Orinoco? Pardon? Yeah. They buy them from Orinoco initially. Right? They buy them from elites who have captured them in war. Now here we have actual kidnapping of children who have been left unattended to be sold as slaves. I will note as well, more on this in a minute, but some Equiano scholars have questioned the veracity of the early part of the narrative. He claims to have been born in what is now Nigeria in 1745. There's a guy by the name of Vincent Carretta who's written what's probably the best biography of Equiano. And Carretta argues that he's found baptismal and Royal Navy records that indicate that Equiano was actually born in South Carolina in 1747 and never set foot in what is now Nigeria.
That's something that I was reading about too that had me interested. Like they were trying to say that his writings about being African himself were just fictional to add to the story.
Yeah, and he would have been familiar with the Middle Passage from speaking to other enslaved people who had directly experienced it. He would have been certainly familiar with the layout of the part of West Africa he describes, mostly, in fact, through reading about it. The passage in which he describes the landscape is actually very, very similar to the description that he's footnoted here by this guy, Anthony Benezet, who gives that account of Guinea.
He describes
So-
the family life really well, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like their caste system.
Yeah, which Carretta argues he also could have got from other sources. He could have learned from people who had been directly taken from Nigeria. Now, Carretta's viewpoint, I should also note, is a minority viewpoint among people who study Equiano. Most Equiano scholars regard the narrative as primarily genuine. And it is, in fact, really, really hard to verify a story like this, given that, one, the culture that Equiano claims to have been taken from was an oral culture, so didn't keep records. And records of slaves in the American colonies and in England tended to be more about sort of numbers transported here and there, age and sex, right? They tended not to individualize people very much, right? Because they're treating them as an object, as property. So it's very, very hard to trace the history of an enslaved individual in the 18th or 19th century. But yeah, so Carretta's argument is that these sort of fabrications are necessary for Equiano's larger purpose. There was a strong abolitionist movement in England in the latter half of the 18th century, in which Equiano was deeply involved. He frequently wrote and published pamphlets that were written in response to pro-slavery arguments. He wrote a lot of, I guess what we now call sort of letters to the editor to local newspapers, arguing for the abolition of slavery. And 1 month after Equiano's narrative was published, almost as though this whole thing was sort of worked out or planned, a member of Parliament by the name of William Wilberforce who was an acquaintance of Equiano's, gave a speech in Parliament demanding the abolition of the slave trade. So, what abolitionists like Wilberforce needed was not so much a guy from an enslaved person from South Carolina. What they wanted was somebody who had directly experienced the horrors of the Middle Passage, somebody who had directly experienced being uprooted and taken from Africa. And so, according to Coretta's theory, Equiano then supplies those fabrications in order to strengthen the argument. The rest of the narrative, by the way, Coretta regards as genuine. He just thinks that the parts about Nigeria, the parts about Africa and the Middle Passage are invented. So, since we are talking a little bit about the political purposes of this, the little preface and dedication here that Equiano writes is actually very clever in a lot of ways. We can focus on that for a second. Page 76. Can I get a volunteer to read this, starting with "To the Lord, Spiritual and Temporal"? Anybody? Yeah, all right, James, go for it.
To the Lord, spiritual and temporal, and the Commons of Parliament of Great Britain. My lords and gentlemen, permit me with the greatest difference and respect to lay at your feet the following genuine narrative, the chief design of which is to excite in your august assemblies a sense of compassion for the miseries which the slave trade has entailed on my unfortunate countrymen. By the horrors of that trade was I first torn away from all the tender connections that were naturally dear to my heart. But these, through the mysterious ways of Providence, I ought to regard as infinitely more than compensated by the introduction I have thence obtained to the knowledge of the Christian religion, and of a nation which, by its liberal sentiments, its humanity, the glorious freedom of its government, and its proficiency in arts and sciences, has exalted the dignity of human nature.
Okay, you can stop there for now, thank you. So this last sentence he writes here, anything strike you as odd about it?
He's pandering to his audience.
It sounds like pandering, right? Is this pandering or irony? One of the most popular theological beliefs in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries in Protestant circles was the idea of what was called the fortunate fall. Now, what fortunate fall theology argued was that it was a good thing that Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate the fruit in the Garden of Eden, because if they hadn't done so, then the human race would not have received Christian redemption. Now, why would they have not received Christian redemption if Adam and Eve had not sinned in the garden? Probably wouldn't be here, and wouldn't have needed it, right? Because you would have still been in that state of grace. So it's kind of it's a kind of backward logic, right? Now, this was often applied by white abolitionists and also by white pro-slavery writers to narratives about the slave trade. That, well, even if slavery is an evil, it introduces these poor, unlettered Africans to the benefits of Western civilization. Right, so if Equiano had never been enslaved, he wouldn't be on the frontispiece of that book, wearing that, fancy coat and ruffled collar and holding a Bible, right? It sounds very Panglossian, doesn't it? right? In the best of all possible worlds, everything is for the good. And what Equiano is doing in that sentence, right? Let's just, read over it again briefly, right? By the horrors of that trade was I first torn away from all the tender connections that were naturally dear to my heart, right? Torn away from family, torn away from homeland. But these, through the mysterious ways of providence, I ought to regard as infinitely more than compensated by the introduction I have thence obtained to the knowledge of the Christian religion, and of a nation which, by its liberal sentiments, its humanity, the glorious freedom of its government, and its proficiency in arts and sciences, has exalted the dignity of human nature. So it sounds like pandering, but he's really taking a shot at them, right? It's like, if it wasn't for your liberal sentiments, if it wasn't for your nation, I would have been happy where I was. And indeed, one of the themes that we see running through the narrative, right, is the way families are broken up. Right? He's separated from his sister. He's separated from his parents. Right? We have on page 78, or pages 77, 78, this little piece about his father. Right? My father was one of those elders or chiefs I have spoken of, and was styled en branche, a term, as I remember, importing the highest distinction and signifying in our language a mark of grandeur. This mark is conferred on the person entitled to it by cutting the skin across the top of the forehead and drawing it down to the eyebrows, and while it is in this situation, applying a warm hand and rubbing it until it shrinks up into a thick wheal across the lower part of the forehead. Most of the judges and senators were thus marked. My father had long borne it. I had seen it conferred on one of my brothers, and I was also destined to receive it by my parents. So this heritage, right, I was to receive this mark of distinction among my people. This is interrupted by his kidnapping, right? This line of continuity is ruined. Basically ends with him. He's never going to get the mark. He's not going to continue the family tradition. Right? He's reunited with his sister only to be torn away from her again, right? So family traditions, family connections, right? All broken asunder, all torn apart. And when he is included in someone else's family life, it's usually temporary, right? If we look on page 90, right, he's purchased by a family living on the coast in Tinma. Right, here they saw me, and having taken a fancy to me, I was bought of the merchant and went home with them. Her house and premises were situated close to one of those rivulets I have mentioned, and were one of the finest I ever saw in Africa. They were very extensive, and she had a number of slaves to attend her. The next day I was washed and perfumed, and when mealtime came I was led into the presence of my mistress, and ate and drank before her with her son. This filled me with astonishment, and I could scarce help expressing my surprise that the young gentleman should suffer me, who was bound, to eat with him who was free. And not only so, but that he would not at any time either eat or drink till I had taken first, because I was the eldest, which was agreeable to our custom. Indeed, everything here, and all their treatment of me, made me forget that I was a slave. The language of these people resembled ours so nearly that we understood each other perfectly. They also had the very same customs as we. There were likewise slaves daily to attend us, while my young master and I with other boys sported with our darts and bows and arrows, as I had been used to do at home. In this resemblance to my former happy state, I passed about 2 months, and I now began to think I was to be adopted into the family. I was beginning to be reconciled to my situation, and to forget by degrees my misfortunes, when all at once the delusion vanished. For without the least previous knowledge, one morning early, while my dear master and companion were still asleep, I was wakened out of my reverie to fresh sorrow, and hurried away even amongst the uncircumcised. So just as he believes he is going to be adopted into this family that has purchased him, what do? Yeah, they sell him off again, right? He gets moved along yet again. So he starts forming connections, forming attachments, and they're severed. Now, when he is brought to the Americas, right, when he first lands in the West Indies on page 95, they told us we were not to be eaten, but to work, and were soon to go on land, where we should see many of our country people. This report eased us much, and sure enough, soon after we were landed, there came to us Africans of all languages. We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard. We were all pent up together like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age. So they're treated as a kind of undifferentiated mass, right? It doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter what languages they speak. It doesn't matter whether they're, men, women, or children. It doesn't matter how old they are. They're all penned up together, treated as the same sort of thing. Essentially treated as a thing. So, not only is the family disrespected in this system, as Equiano argues, so is the individual. This is of a piece with, the fact that he keeps getting renamed, right, and punished when he refuses to abide by the new name. Right, erasure of family ties, erasure of individuality. Now, do you notice any points of connection or points of important difference between this and Rousseau's memoir? How is this like or unlike the Confessions?
It's a first-person account of all the stuff they went through.
Okay, yeah, on the one hand, yeah, it is, broadly speaking, an autobiography, right? So it is a first-person account of, this is my life history, right? These are my triumphs and sufferings, and so on and so forth, right? What was Rousseau's purpose in recounting his history? What was he trying to do?
I wanted to spread a word about something he was trying to say in those words were happening.
Yeah, on the one hand, yeah, he's trying to beat his enemies to the punch, right? No, this is what really happened, straight from the horse's mouth. But he's also making an argument for the importance of what? Like, what's the philosophical bent of the Confessions? What does Rousseau focus on, particularly early in the narrative? Yeah, the importance of childhood, right? And the way childhood experiences in childhood and youth leave a powerful impression on you that follows you into adulthood, right? So he's making an argument about personal psychology and the way the individual personality is formed. Does Equiano seem to be making a similar argument? Does he seem to be much interested in the way the individual personality is formed? Or is he more interested in the way it's warped, stunted, and destroyed through inclusion in a particular system? What's the first thing Rousseau says about himself at the very beginning of the Confessions? What's the gist of that first little preamble? How does he regard himself in comparison to others? Yes. If I was not better than that man, at least I was different, right? So he makes this insistence at the very beginning on his individuality. Right? I am not like other people. You are not like other people. Everyone is different. Everyone is an individual. Now let's look at the first paragraph of chapter 1 of Equiano's narrative. Can I get somebody to read that paragraph on page 77? You're going to volunteer. All right, Chris, go for it.
I believe it is difficult for those who publish their own memoirs to escape the imputation of vanity, nor is this the only disadvantage under which they labor. It is also their misfortune that what is uncommon is rarely, if ever, believed, and what is obvious we are apt to turn from with disgust, and to charge the writer with impertinence. People generally think those memoirs only worthy to be read or remembered which abound in great or striking events, those, in short, which in a high degree excite either admiration or pity. All others they consign to contempt and oblivion. It is therefore, I confess, not a little hazardous in a private and obscure individual, and a stranger too, thus to solicit the indulgent attention of the public. Especially when I offer here the history of neither a saint, a hero, nor a tyrant. I believe there are few events in my life which have not happened to many. It is true the incidents of it are numerous, and did I consider myself an European, I might say my sufferings were great, but when I compare my lot with that of most of my countrymen, I regard myself as a particular favorite of heaven, and acknowledge the mercies of Providence in every occurrence of my life. If then the following narrative does not appear sufficiently interesting to engage general attention, let my motive be some excuse for its publication. I am not so foolishly vain as to expect from it either immortality or literary reputation. If it affords any satisfaction to my numerous friends at whose request it has been written, or in the smallest degree promotes the interest of humanity, the ends for which it was undertaken will be fully attained, and every wish of my heart gratified. Let it therefore be remembered that in wishing to avoid censure, I do not aspire to praise.
All right, thanks, Chris. So how does this differ from Rousseau?
Similar.
Yeah, the setup is pretty similar, right? But as Rousseau is insisting on his difference, right? What is Equiano arguing about himself? Is he making an assertion of his difference or his individuality?
He's saying he got lucky. Basically.
Yeah. The hand of providence has lifted me into prosperity, right? He does not attribute his good fortune to his own actions, but to the invisible actions of the hand of God, right? That plucked him up. Why should this hand have favored him in any way?
No one knows.
Yeah. He doesn't claim to know, right? Rousseau presents his experiences and his personality as unique. Equiano, on the other hand, presents his personality and experiences as typical. Right? The things that have happened to me have happened to millions of other people, right? I'm not different. I'm not special. I'm luckier, but it was not through any special virtue of my own. It was not through any uniqueness on my part that my story has ended in the way that it does. So what does this suggest about a difference in purpose, right? Rousseau is celebrating his own individuality. Equiano, meanwhile, is insisting on his typicality.
So Rousseau's fighting for himself, and Equiano's fighting for the people.
Yeah, Equiano is fighting a battle on behalf of others, right? And he's including himself in that mass of others whose rights he's trying to secure. So he makes himself a member of that group, right? I am one of these people. I am among those who will be affected by this legislation, in order to strengthen the ethos of his argument, right? To strengthen, his character. Rousseau's not making a political argument, right? Rousseau's making an argument about theories of human personality and using himself as an example. So if Rousseau believes that it is our individual experiences that make us into unique individuals, what Equiano is arguing is that it's this common experience of an inhuman system that crushes the individuality out of us. And at this point, it's only luck that lifts a few people out of it. All right, so does anybody have any questions about this? That's basically all I have to say. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, then remember midterm on Thursday. I do have some reading questions for you for the first part of Goethe's Faust Part 1. And we'll see you on Thursday.